Good afternoon, Mr. Connell. We have Mr. Fernie.
Fernie, we do, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fernie. As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite you. First, I understand you're prepared to affirm.
Yes, I am, my lord.
Sitting where you are, would you repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Fernie. Now, I anticipate that your evidence will probably take the whole afternoon, by which I mean until about 4 o'clock. But if you want to take a break at any stage, just give me an indication and we can take a break. And the other thing I always would say to a witness at this stage is, can I encourage you to speak a little louder and maybe a little slower than you would in normal conversation? So, it's important that you're heard.
Try to do that.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Connell.
Thank you, my lord. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Fernie. I'll start by asking you the formal question that we always ask witnesses, which is this, that you've provided the inquiry with a witness statement, and I'll be turning to that shortly. Are you content to adopt that as part of your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, your role in the project at the, let's just call it the new hospital to avoid getting into the full narrative of the name, was initially as a project construction manager, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And then, due to the untimely demise of one of the team, project director, is that correct?
Yes.
So these are both reasonably senior positions in the hierarchy building the hospital, is that so?
Very much so.
On the part of the contractor. Can we just go to your witness statement, just so I'm clear what your position is? If we go to the very foot of, I'm using page numbers that come from an electronic bundle, page 6 at the top of the page should come up. Now, at the very foot of that page, you're asked a question, well framed or not, which is generally designed to see what you know about specific regulations that apply in healthcare construction. You see that there. So we see your answer emerging at the top of page 7. We just get there. Yep. I noted from your brief CV that you included that you have been involved in healthcare projects previously to this one. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
You're asked, what your knowledge was of healthcare regulations, and you say in answer, I was able to access any regulations required directly or via the supply chain. You understand them incorporated into the contract. I just wondered, did you need to have, in the context of the post you had at the new hospital, an understanding of any of the relevant healthcare regulations?
I guess, and there were 2 posts. So my post is the project manager, who was focused on delivering the construction of the hospital.
I just ask you, just speak up a little more.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
So,
thought
it's primarily so his lordship makes sure he hears everything.
Okay, so my initial post is construction lead for the hospital. The relevant standards would be on the documents that I'd be reading. So the architectural information, the mechanical information would all be available to me on that platform. And that would be very similar to the information, even as project director, I would rely on the information issued through the design process to allow me to construct a building.
Yes, well, I'm going to come back to what you were actually doing. But I think in the next question and answer on your statement, you accept that you understand that compliance with various guidance and regulations is very important in healthcare.
I do, yes.
I'm keen to understand the extent, if any, to which you applied that issue to the job that you were actually doing in this actual contract. Can I ask you another general question? This was an NEC3 design and build contract. Now, we're going back some years. The contract was signed in the tail end of 2009. How familiar with that contract were you at that time?
So I had previously worked for one of the alternate bidders. So I was given access to counselling on the style of contract, which it was beneficial for me in relation to taking on the role in construction for multiplex.
Yeah, so do I take the alternate bidder, I assume, is Balfour Beatty, because that's where your previous role was. Is that right?
Yes.
Not that matters, it's just so
Yes.
we're clear. And does that mean that prior to starting in this position, you hadn't actually had to operate a contract under those provisions before?
That's correct.
Now, if we go to page 8, because I'm keen that you have what you've said in your statement in front of you when I ask you supplementary questions. You see that there's a little letter D about 2/3 of the way down that page, and you're saying, well, who was responsible for ensuring that Multiplex complied with the terms of the contract? Responsibility across all the disciplines, and then what responsibility, if any, did Multiplex have for ensuring the built hospital complied with the relevant guidance, such as SHTM and SHFN? Now, you say, well, that's our job, we have to ensure that. Now, is that, first of all, is that something that was part of your role in this contract?
So as project director?
Yeah, well, but initially as construction manager
construction
and then
lead.
as project director. And tell me if they're different.
So my role as construction lead would be to ensure that the works were carried out in accordance with the information I was able to access. That would be specifications, construction drawings, and those would be taken off the 2D version and put into practice on site. So the standards would be from, the very early days when we started the piling process through to the substructure, superstructure, cladding, curtain walling, roofing, and then into the fit out area.
I'll maybe come back to that point a little later, Mr. Fernie. I wondered if you had any view, given your experience on this question, in the context of this type of contract and this project. What effectively was done was something called the employer's requirements were put together.
Yes.
You know that was done.
I understand that, yeah.
And that then went out to the various prospective bidders. Are you able to offer any view as to the extent to which it would be understood that these employers' requirements could be changed in subsequent discussions at any time before somebody put the pen, sign the contract?
I'm not speaking from memory in this instance, but I would speak from my understanding of the process that the employer's requirements would be developed into a design developed programme, which in turn, if you were as a bidder giving an option or a betterment, then the employer's requirements may, I think, be changed in that process.
And when, just so I'm clear, you use the word betterment, do you anticipate by that something which is perceived to be better than what's in the requirements themselves?
Yeah, it's difficult to get a measurement on what betterment is, but betterment would not always be a reduction in price or better value from a monetary aspect, but it may give something like a better building performance.
Thank you. While I'm on the question, these general questions of contracts, on page 9, you asked about working relationships, particularly with the project team, which is something we always see capitalised. It's always capital P project, capital T team. And you say about 2/3 of the way down page 9 that your relationship was focused on working together delivering the project as a team. Is that something that was particularly required by this contract?
Yeah, so there's a kind of dialogue in relation to how this contract's executed. And perhaps to give some background, traditionally in construction, people would work in silos, and you would have a client team, architectural team, construction team. Construction would take the information and drive the job to get it to completion. With large, very large projects like this, that doesn't work. That means that there's opportunity for many problems to occur. Not saying that this contract style doesn't negate the need for other complications, but the premise behind this contract is that there is an open dialogue throughout the process of when it's bidding, or when you're going through the FBC process, or when you're actually delivering the project.
Thank you. Another introductory matter that you were asked about, which appears put at page 9 and then going on to page 10, you're being asked about an organisation called Curry and Brown. Do you remember them being involved in the contract?
I do, yes.
On page 10, the first, about third of the way down, you asked, describe Curry and Brown's role and responsibilities. Are you aware of any changes to their role? And you say they had a number of managers. They reported on cost and project management.
Yes.
Now, we should probably just establish now, so we understand your answer. You arrived in this project, I think, in February 2011, is that right?
That's correct.
So when you say you don't recall any changes, that's from the time you arrived?
That's it, of course, yes.
And I just wanted to ask you a couple of things about this, because your immediate answer to the question is, describe their role, and you say they reported on cost and project management. But is that the way that you remember their role?
I remember, I guess, the roles of the people that I worked with. So there was Douglas Ross, who was very focused on commercial, and there was David Hall, who was a project manager.
I've seen the expression commercial from time to time. I assume it's something to do with costing, but can you help my education on the topic?
Yeah, I'll try to. We, as a construction company, we submit a monthly report to request payment on the basis of how much work we've completed on the design and in the construction fabric. Douglas would probably review that report and make payment on the basis of it being acceptable, or perhaps query some of the items that were in that. That would have the dialogue sessions.
Right. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Hall, who you remember as a project manager,
Yes.
can I just ask this? From your contact with him, was he a ventilation engineer?
A ventilation engineer?
Yes.
No, I don't think so.
So in the next question, you asked, well, did Curry and Brown have a role in ensuring contract compliance, which is a phrase that we've heard. And you say members of the Curry and Brown team would carry out reviews and give advice to the project team, and were, I believe, involved in reviewing the design process.
Yes.
Now, what do you mean by involved in reviewing the design process in light of the evidence that you've just given us?
So there could be a number of items during any one of the project meetings that required some clarification. I'm kind of struggling to give you an example, but I will try and come back to that if I can. David would often take an action to take it from the project review meetings, which would touch on design, and discuss it with either the internal project team, as in the NHS Greater Glasgow team, or discuss it with myself or someone like Darren Pike, for instance, if it was a mechanically based question, and ask us to then discuss it with our technical experts, who would be the design team that work for Multiplex.
Can I just then follow that up by asking this? Your answers are based on what you recall of the people you encountered, including Mr. Hall and Mr. Ross. Were you aware of Mr. Hall, during your period there, having a team of technical experts to consult?
I think the best way to describe that is that we were his technical experts, and we would pass that back to our design teams to process any questions within any processes that were ongoing at that time.
Sorry, just give me that again. The question is, were you aware of Mr. Hall having a technical team? And your answer is?
So in my view, the technical part of the job was delivered by Multiplex. We were the design build contractor. So his first port of call would have been Multiplex. And I'm talking probably more as the project director now as rather than the construction lead. He would also have members of his own team. So he would have people like Francis Rath and the project management team as well, Heather. And some of the other team, the names just are escaping me at present, but I'll get them.
Heather Griffin, perhaps.
Yes, that's
Mary
it.
McLeod.
Mary
perhaps.
McLeod, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter Moyer would be there as well. But I think they were fulfilling a role which meant that David would often come to the construction team or the design delivery contractor and ask for advice on how to go forward on certain elements.
Now, you then asked some questions about another of the players, Capita, and I needn't ask you about that, but I did want to ask you about another point where you may be able to give us some general assistance. Can we see bundle 26, document 3 at page 202? What I'm showing you here, Mr. Fernie, is an extract from the employer's requirements. And you see in the middle of the page a heading, Control of Infection, and a general statement in block capitals, prevention and control of infection shall remain a primary consideration of the contractor in the design and construction of the works. Now, you arrive after the design's been done, so I'm not about to ask you about that, but I mean, first of all, were you aware of this provision?
Yes, I was.
And can you help us at all understand how prevention and control of infection becomes a practical consideration during construction, because that's what you were dealing with?
Can you ask me that question again? Because when you talk to me about construction, I immediately think about what I'm doing on site. Could you just ask it again, please?
Well, if I read short what is said in front of us, it says prevention and control of infection shall remain a primary consideration of the contractor in the construction of the works. It's a very broad statement. It's a very general statement. And then there's some detailed comments about design. I'm just wondering whether as a construction professional, you could allow us to understand how you actually put that into practice.
Okay, so for fear of sounding repetitive, the practice is put in place through the information that's in the design drawings and the specifications thereupon. So my experience of infection control is only that which is presented in that information. I am not obviously an infection control expert, but I would make sure that if there was walls that required a protection on it to ensure that infection control could be managed laterally, then I would make sure that that was part of the sign-off process, inspection and testing at the end. similar for ceilings and flooring in particular.
So you're reliant on what you're given to look for features that may have an infection prevention and control issue with them. Is that right?
Very much so. And if there was anything that stood out, so if you look at expansion joints in the theatre blocks, for example, they're very difficult to manage from a infection control because by their very nature, there's a space and a gap in the wall where infection could gather. So we need to make sure that the expansion joints are compliant. And that would have been something that had been put through as a sample and would have been approved back into the mix with visibility through the infection control team or individual, whoever it may have been at that time.
Well, that's the next follow-up question. We can take that off the screen, thanks. We'll go back to your witness statement at page 13. You're asked a question at the top of that page. In what ways were infection prevention and control staff involved in the construction process? And then you answer that by saying they were, I understand, involved in the design process, and then you give some examples of that. But you don't actually tell us what you mean by, whether IPC staff were involved during the construction process. You say you believe they were on site, but your contact with them was very limited. Is that the extent of the evidence you can help with?
It is actually, because that infection control team would have worked through the project team rather than having an interface with someone like me. So my engagement with that as part of the team would have been very, very minimal.
So, although you say that you believe they're on site, you can't assist us with who or how.
I can't. Not names. Not now.
Sure. Now, you're then asked about something that happened long before you arrived, because obviously at the time these questionnaires were framed, we didn't necessarily know who had done what. But can we go to page 16? Because we've been asking on the previous pages about something that the inquiry has called the ventilation derogation, which is essentially an arrangement under which the standard room air change rate moved from 6 in guidance to 2.5 for reasons that we didn't go into with you. And you're asked about halfway down page 16, well, when did you become aware that this was something that had happened? And you say you don't recall. I suppose that the question is this: you're holding quite a senior position. Should you not know about that because you need to think about it when you're doing your job?
I could see why you would think that, and my answer to that is that as a construction lead, I am very much focused on the information that's presented to me to allow the process to go forward. So I need to make sure that information comes at a certain time to allow the process to go through for the supply chain to then procure and deliver and then install the construction equipment or the construction fabric. I at that point, because I understand there's a process prior to that information coming to me, which has been through a number of reviews, I don't see it as a change. I just see the information I've got to deliver, and that is how I would proceed on that basis. I wouldn't start to question it unless there was something inherently that would jump out at me at that point.
Yeah, I think the question probably is this, that you've been involved in healthcare projects, you know the importance of guidance and so on. Do you, wearing the hats that you had, manager and then director, do you, step back and review what you've got to see whether it appears to be in accordance with guidance or what you remember of guidance or anything of that kind?
The honest answer on that is that measure the success of the project on the basis of the information that's signed off. So you don't necessarily step back and say, does this comply with what specification A, B, or C says? You simply focus on the information you've got because you're relying on the process having been agreed prior to it reaching you. And so because there is a lengthy process that requires people to have reviewed and understood what it is they're signing or agreeing to allow the process to progress for the main contractor to then take that drawing information and turn it into something tangible, which is the building, then I wouldn't say you don't have that luxury, but you're conditioned not to do that, I guess, because you're believing the information in front of you is correct and delivers what the intended purpose was, whether that was part of the technical standards or it was part of what the client ultimately requested.
Now, just so I'm clear, are there any exceptions to that? I thought you may have hinted a minute or two ago that, if something jumped out or words to that effect.
Yeah,
Let me give you a hypothetical and ridiculous example. If somebody told you to build a hospital operating theatre with no ventilation in it, and that's what the drawings showed, and they'd been through a process and come out to you, would you just carry on and build it?
I would certainly question something as obvious as that. I'm not sure that the air changes jumped out at me as being something that I would necessarily cause alarm at in relation to the general wards. And I probably was led and guided by some of the members of my team during that period, and that would have, I guess, been highlighted at the latter part of the job for me had there been queries around not achieving the building rates that were signed off.
I think you do cover this later in your witness statement. We'll just take it now, since you've mentioned it. Things like a ventilation system, we've had other evidence earlier in the inquiry that you really need to get that fixed very early on because it affects ceiling voids, duct sizes,
Can do.
plant size, and so on, depending on what the issue is. So somebody coming along just before people are about to move in and saying, we're not happy with this, is a bit late, isn't it? Because you can't really do much about it.
Yes, but you would have expected that process to have happened long before you put the building on site. Right? So you wouldn't, in my experience, the checks and balances have already been carried out. That information would have, what I'm constructing today was agreed perhaps 2 or 3 years ago in any large scale construction project. If you look at the hospital project in its own right, it's a village essentially that you're putting together, and you're doing it across an area of ground, and you're doing it vertically as well. And in some instances, you've finished parts of the building to almost like this room here, so it's no longer a building site as such, but you have concrete being poured 7 or 8 floors above it because of the time it takes to build these buildings. So there was opportunity, I think, fairly early on in the process to allow that conversation to, if it had been missed, if anything had been missed, exemplar rooms were ready and available for people to review. Timings and dates of those I don't have in my head, but they would have been very advanced to allow those who ultimately were going to take ownership of the building to be comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that your evidence is, well, I think you told me people need to know what they're agreeing during the design process in order to, and that's no doubt self-evident. And if something crops up during the design process that creates an issue, no doubt it can be discussed. That assumes, of course, there's somebody involved in that process who knows what the issue is.
or indeed if it's picked up during the design process. You know, that's why we end up having changes on construction projects, because design often has human error.
Yeah. And one can understand at the end, when you're doing handover, that people are going around carrying out checks, commissioning and so forth. Just help me understand then how, particularly on a technical issue like ventilation, somebody would know at some intermediate stage, what process would be going on during some intermediate stage that would allow somebody to say, whoa, there's an issue here?
So I think it would be difficult to highlight there was an issue if the results of the commissioning are in line with the expected rates for the design at that time. And it's at that point, if you were looking at it in future, you might have a check or a hold point that takes you back to this technical requirements of a standard hospital. But when you're doing that testing and commissioning, the practice to date has not been to do that. The practice has always been that you test your building on the basis of your design and specification and what has been signed off perhaps 2 years ago.
Yeah. So somebody builds to the construction drawings, and then you check against, in effect, what's been built following these drawings.
Yes, and what would be highlighted would be if you weren't getting the results that were required of the technical information on the basis of the drawings and specification. That would immediately throw up a red flag, and there would have to be a review carried out as to why. But you wouldn't revert back. In my experience, you would not revert back to the SHTMs or, you know, the larger design part of what a hospital looks like.
Sure. Just so we see the way you've summarised the position you've explained to us much more fully today, and thank you for that. Page 17. It's basically summed up in an answer near the foot of that page. The construction team take the information that's provided throughout the design approval process and proceed on that basis.
That's exactly what we do.
Yeah. And neither you nor anyone else in the follow-on steps really goes back prior to that.
I don't believe they do, because the technical advisors would assess the competency of the building on the design at that point as well.
Just for completeness, I think earlier in that page you were asked about the significance of BREEAM and whether it was given any particular priority, and you said, well, you're aware of it, but you're not aware of it being given any particular priority.
No more or no less than any other element that's in the process.
Thank you. Your name crops up in a few slightly random places, Mr. Fernie, in the sense that, you know, you've explained your journey on the site, but you also appear once or twice. I wonder if I could ask you to look at bundle 12, page 785, just so we understand your role in this. This is a lot later. We're away into 2016 now, and this is a communication that comes from you. Now, am I picking up from what you say in your witness statement at pages 18 and 19 that although you're the sender of the communication, you're not the originator of the information?
So this is a very technical, I guess. I know there's a technical conversation in the background and in the forefront here in relation to what's happening in relation to this email. So I would seek guidance from members of my team, and the date of this happens quite some time after the project has been completed. And so I would probably take guidance from a number of members of the team and or design team to allow me to facilitate the answer back to David.
Now, I wanted to ask you a couple of things about that, and if it's not within your expertise, please just do.
Thank you.
Tell me. this statement here says that the guidance, which is to be SHPN 04, does not exclude ventilation from both ensuite and isolation room. Now, that arises as an issue, I think, because the design of the isolation rooms as built did not follow the design as set out in the guidance.
Yep.
Do you know anything about whether that's right or wrong?
I don't. No, I'm relying on partners in the business to guide me through that process.
And the slightly odd bit, and maybe you can or cannot help us with it about this communication, is that this appears to be an information request which relates to what's called the Schehallien ward, the Ward 2A, as we sometimes call it, pediatric hemato-oncology. And in sending this email, you say, well, in any event, what are you referring to SHPN 0401 anyway? Because it doesn't apply to wards with immunocompromised patients in. Now, I wonder whether that's a slightly odd response, because if it doesn't apply, what are you building? Something that is said to be compliant in that ward. Should you not be building something different? Do you understand the point I'm asking about?
I do.
And can you help us at all on it?
I do understand the point, but I have to be clear that this email would have been written for me, and I would have then satisfied that the information I was sending back was suitable.
So you're reliant on others to provide you with the technical material that's contained there.
Very much so.
And in fact, you go on to say, just so we get all of this at the same time, we've looked back at the drawing approval process, and then you say it seems to have been signed off by the board and their advisors, Capita. So on this email, at least, Capita are being given the role of providing some assistance to the board in that part of the design process.
So I think Capita, in this reference here, would have inspected the works that were completed and had I understand, raised no concerns that we were not compliant to the drawings.
Yeah, well, I don't think, in fairness, that's the point that's being made in this paragraph.
I see.
Because I think if you read it, it says that the first drawings that were issued as part of the RDD process, so that's the reviewable design section, the earlier section that happened before you were there.
Yeah.
It said that the first drawings were issued did represent what is now being asked for, ensuite extract only. So, which you can take it from me as what the guidance essentially shows. And then the solution was changed and to what was built, and it was signed off by the board and their advisors. So presumably that the writer is trying to make some point that, well, so what? You signed it off.
I'm not sure if they were saying so what. There was never that sort of dialogue between ourselves and the board, but there would have been a confirmation that there was a signature down the line.
Yeah, can I just go on to 786 to make sure we're not missing any text? And then it said, that's the point you were making, and then nobody picked it up during the later process. Yes. One of the issues that this inquiry has got into in relation to the ventilation derogation is how you should record something that derogates from guidance. You should be clear who agreed it, when they agreed it, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, topics like that.
Yes.
Would you agree as a matter of principle that that's a good idea?
I do.
And I suppose what appears to emerge from this email is your company saying, well, we take it this is agreed because somebody has signed it off during the process. So there isn't actually any written discussion of departure from the guidance. It's simply that it's happened and Capita have signed it off. that on the face of it doesn't kind of meet the, at least aim of making any derogations from guidance clear and easily discoverable. Would you agree?
I would think that the conversations and so whilst that letter may or could have been perhaps in hindsight now written better or given a bit more detail or dialogue behind it, I think that it's essentially saying that during the design development process, there was the opportunity to have a review of what the MEP or what the building fabric was going to be like. Now, how clear that was back then, I'm not sure of.
No, I think this is what I'm trying to ask you about, and I'm just keen to get your experience on it, is if you're doing it, right, go back. In a debate over the ventilation derogation, the idea was, let's make these things clear as possible. And there are debates as to how far that was achieved in that case, and you're not involved in that debate.
Yes.
But if you have this design process, which essentially involves the production of drawings, some kind of discussion, and a signature at the end of it, there's nothing elsewhere, no other document, no record, no narrative that actually says, it would appear, the parties agreed that following guidance document, which is in employer's requirements at this page, would not be followed in this respect for these rooms for this reason. So unless you happen to get into the detail of the process, you don't know.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering whether you agree that, at least in principle, that is undesirable.
Because of it, well, you're not asking me what my involvement was during the design development process.
No, because you
because
weren't
I wasn't there. On the face of it, if I can only answer that if information is not clear to whoever's signing off, or in some instances agreeing to that design, then we should definitely try to improve that. How the information was presented on something like Aconex and passed between the parties would be far more detailed than, I think a set of minutes. So the drawing information being passed back and forward was, large volumes of information. And as well as I wasn't involved in that process at the start, at the back end, I could see how that process was managed and who were given the opportunity to be involved in those reviews.
I suppose I can put the question this way. If you were looking, you arrive perhaps late on the scene, perhaps you change jobs or whatever, you're looking to find what departures there were from guidance that had been specified way back when the requirements had drawn up. We've had one debate about the ventilation derogation, but to find this one, you have to work your way back through a design process and look for a signature and work out that the design that's signed off isn't in fact compliant. It's not otherwise patent on anything.
Okay.
You see what I'm getting at?
I understand now.
And would you agree, in principle, it should be possible to do better than that?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not in a log and it's not clear, then absolutely, in principle, I would agree that.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask you about another small point? Bundle 12, page 416. Let's see where Mr. Fernie appears here. Am I right? This is another email further on in the process, September 15, so that's after handover and indeed after patient migration. Now, is this you or is this technical people providing you with information on this occasion?
So I think there'd be a mix of both, and I would have checked back with somebody like David Wilson in relation to the testing of the rooms, and then my commentary along the lines of whatever we need to do to resolve the situation. Then, as multiplex, we would be very front and centre in doing that, and it was certainly not a cost issue that was driving any decision-making process at that point.
I should, in fairness to you, have shown you the incoming email first, so that's
I remember
entirely
it from
my
the
fault.
bundles, actually, so.
It's just at the foot there, because the reason I want to show you this, sorry, 416, footer 416, the request is, can you confirm that Multiplex have constructed and commissioned all of the rooms in the Schiehallion ward? So we're back to the 2A, which, as we subsequently know, became an issue. The Schiehallion ward in full accordance with the specification, including SHTM, and they are compliant. And you say you've constructed the rooms to the correct specification.
That's
But
right.
you don't actually say you've constructed them to SHTM.
So what I should have said, and to make it absolutely clear, is that I constructed the room to the contract, and the contract was the drawings that I had.
Okay, so this is the same point you've been making to us earlier, that
It is.
as the construction chap, what you're saying is, I got a drawing and I built it to that. And you're asked about SHTM, but you don't know. You assume things have happened in the design phase, but you don't directly know what the position is about SHTM.
Yes, I have yeah, like I said before, I have the information in front of me, and that's went through the process, which has allowed me to then take it from a drawing and put it into a fabric.
So that if we kind of take this as a communication at or around the time the hospital has been handed over, slightly later, September. When you finish your build job, wearing your construction hat, you simply know you've built to the drawings.
I've built to what we would classify as the contracted works. Yeah, and that's drawings and specification and.
So there really isn't any point asking you whether you built it to guidance or employers' requirements or anything else. You simply, because all you can say, because you don't go backwards, you've explained to us, all you can say is you built it to the drawings.
And that was me trying to give David that clarity there, that whilst there was a mention of SHTMs, that what he's building is in accordance with the information that was signed off at the.
Yeah. Well, and I suspect that's where the clarity may have slipped from an outside reader's perspective, and we're all reading this with our own perceptions, because he says, tell me you built this to the guidance.
Yeah.
And you say, I've built it to the drawing. Is that right?
That's exactly it. And that.
So you're kind of.
Well, I'm trying to be very clear with David at that point, so that there's no mistaking that, you know, he's not expecting that his building should perform in one way or another. It should perform exactly how the information that's set out in the drawings tells it to.
Thank you. If we just move, we can leave that one, thanks, and move to back to your witness statement. I'm not going to ask you about everything in it, you'll be pleased to know, but we'll use it as a guide to walk us through some of the issues that crop up.
Okay.
Page 21, you're asked about what your knowledge is of there being wards which involved immune compromised pediatric patients, and you say at this stage you can't really recall what was what, and then you make the same point. I think the way you put it here, but halfway down page 21, is the focus was to ensure not stepping outside of the construction issue information. So that's what your aim is that right?
That's it.
So, although you say at the time you probably had a kind of general overview of any of the specialist departments.
So yeah, because I would have the departments. And depending on what part of the project, I'm looking at concrete specification drawings. You know, I'm then looking at theatre information. You know, it's such a diverse range of product that you deal with on such a fabulous project, really. As someone who's in construction, it's got everything that you ever want to do.
So you may be looking at concrete or electrics or anything else on one particular day.
Absolutely, and then you can be looking at a theatre suite and how the theatres go together. But you also are mindful of what the departments are, so that you have a form of understanding, but you're not looking at it as any form of clinical expertise, obviously.
And I think you asked similar questions about whether you knew about wards 4B and 4C, and you give similar answers. You can't remember directly what their position was. Now, if I just come to 25, just because I think it is probably a point at which to acknowledge an error on the part of the questioner. You were asked about suspended ceilings. Now, we were firmly rapped over the knuckles by the architect for complaining about suspended ceilings, because the question shouldn't really be about suspended ceiling, because they were all suspended ceilings in one way or another.
Yes.
It was the finish of the ceiling viewed from the room, as it were, that may or may not have been important. The reason I think you were asked about it was that there was an issue in 4B which was discovered, that sealed plasterboard ceilings might have been the desired objective, but a non-sealed grid had been applied instead. And that was then dealt with and fixed. Do you remember that?
I remember elements around it, yes.
I suppose that one of the slightly technical points that's taken by a number of the witness statements that we've seen is that the way this contract works, if the builder finds something that's not compliant, they're supposed to tell the employer, as opposed to the employer digging around and trying to find something wrong. The builder is supposed to raise what's described as a non-compliance.
Yes.
And you say in answer to a question about this, I don't know whether Multiplex raised a non-compliance. I suppose my question is, how would they know if you're simply working off construction drawings?
Well, that's a very key point. Ultimately, the fact that there was a lay-in grid ceiling installed in some of these rooms where it might have been a plasterboard ceiling would not have been picked up as part of the process for the construction delivery team.
Because it's said to have emerged from something called a clinical output specification, which arose in a much earlier stage and wouldn't be seen by you.
No, I wouldn't have saw that.
You're asked on the same page about backup air handling plants, and you say you don't know because that's dealt with in design, and you say you don't know the intended occupants of 4C, which is apparently where the original occupants of 4B were going to be moved. Can I just come back to this question of some kind of intermediate opportunity for finding a problem? Page 27. You say, if any concerns had arisen during the construction phase, I would have expected them to be flagged, either by the multiplex team or by the Capita team. Now, if the multiplex team is doing what you're telling us you're doing, which is working off the construction drawings and not going back behind that, how would they flag something like that?
Well, they wouldn't. So, and I'm sorry if I've led to some confusion there. What I'm saying is, we have our own inspection and test plans on site that are a sign-off process and hold points above ceilings. We then have an inspection by the building control officer to ensure that they are happy that we're doing things like firewall and compartmentation correct. We then, as we go through the process, we have a number of points that Capita's team would have came and witnessed to allow us to close up areas. And that could be from external walls, looking at insulation, to above ceilings and that the ductwork's been completed. If they've highlighted something in the reports during the process of the construction period, we would want to ensure that they had the opportunity to inspect that, to give a commitment that we had completed the works to the satisfaction of the specification and to the standards set out in the contract.
The further down on that page, we go back to what we've been calling Schiehallion Ward and 2A and 2B, and you don't remember the specifics of that. We may already have had this from you, about middle of the way page. You say for compliance, multiplex would have had a testing and commissioning program followed by inspection and sign off. Now, you say in accordance with a signed off design. What you actually mean there, do you not, is in accordance with the construction drawings.
Which to my mind would be information that had been through the RDD process and had been agreed by the teams that had to agree it.
And the testing and commissioning, both of these, I think I'm right, and please correct me if I've not picked up your earlier evidence, would be done by reference to the construction drawings.
Absolutely.
They're both testing and commissioning. So you test, somebody comes in, witnesses it, but you're testing off the construction drawings.
We're testing the construction drawings because that is the agreed route to completion as far as I'm concerned.
And this is why I asked you, particularly in relation to ventilation, by the time you're at the stage of commissioning, which is checking all the bits of work and so on, it's really too late to do anything significant to that system, isn't it? Because you've built the structures within which the ventilation has to be held, you've built your plant rooms, you've built your ducts, all these things are in place.
And I think that's the importance of the design review. That emphasises the importance of ensuring that you get it right at that stage. And construction is fraught with design not being managed correctly at times, and then the construction team having to make alterations because it's not stood up to the contracted drawings. If that makes sense.
So I may have asked you this already, in which cases apologies. Do you agree that in the context of a project like this, it's important to get the ventilation requirements right very early on?
That and everything else. So even if you get your concrete mix wrong, you're going to have a massive problem down the line. So everything that you do needs to be checked and verified during the design process, because it's the jigsaw that we then build on site.
And do you know, and if you don't know, please tell me, because you've arrived late-ish on the scene here, do you know who was checking the ventilation wearing a GGC hat?
As in from the project team?
Yeah. Or under the control of the project team?
So I'm just trying to think if I know the answer to this, because I've been reading up in the.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm interested in what you knew, at the time.
I think it would be only fair of me to say that I wasn't clear on who was doing that. I think it's fair.
I mean, just so that I'm keeping up, when you ask who is checking on ventilation on behalf of the project team, what stage are we at?
Prior to the issue of the construction drawings that this witness has been telling us were his baseline holy grail, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, prior to instruction.
Prior to that. And that's so, as I understand the witness's answer, and Mr. Fernie is about to correct me if I'm not picking him up right, the answer, Lord, as I take it, is that Mr. Fernie was not, first of all, Mr. Fernie was not there. We've established that during the design process, but it wasn't clear to Mr. Fernie who had been checking the ventilation details on either in the project team or on behalf of the project team. Now, is that correct, Mr. Fernie?
That's at that point, yes.
Thank you very much. One issue that did crop up, and I'm going to come back to this when I'm talking about commissioning and validation, because I want to ask you about that, was the isolation rooms and room pressure testing.
Yep.
Which cropped up, near the end of the job. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
I think the broad question is this. First of all, I think I'm right in understanding something like 32 isolation rooms hadn't been pressure tested. Do you remember that?
I don't recall that.
Do you recall an issue about isolation rooms not having been pressure tested?
When you say pressure tested, do you mean air leakage testing, or do you mean pressure testing from the air positive pressure,
Air
negative pressure?
permeability, for instance.
I do recall that, and was this before January 15?
Yeah, I'll show you
After.
some documents in a minute.
That would
I
help.
suppose what I'm about to suggest is what appears to have happened is that after you might have expected all of that to be done, it was discovered that some of these rooms hadn't been tested in the way that they should have been. And I wondered if you could help us as to how that could have happened.
I would probably need to understand the dates of that. Was that prior to practical completion or after practical completion?
I'm going to ask you about practical completion as well.
Okay.
But can we have bundle 12, document 51, page 353, please? So I got my numbers wrong. My apologies. This is a supervisor's notification of defect dated September. So this is considerably after handover,
Yes.
and in fact after patient migration, which was somewhere around June. Isolation rooms, following the discovery that air permeability tests were not carried out within 36 isolation rooms in accordance with the requirements. And then the inference is you're getting on with it now. Do you now remember this cropping up? Because you seem to be on the distribution list.
Yeah. My memory of it is very faint, but I do recall having some conversations that perhaps the project team who were left in place after I came out of the project, that there was certainly some conversation around that, and perhaps there was confusion between the commissioning on the air pressures versus the fabric air leakage. And
I suppose that we're always looking in this inquiry to think of how can we look at things that didn't quite work and perhaps suggest how they could work better. Can you help us at all as to how something of that parent scale, 36 isolation rooms, could have happened?
I guess it would be, and I'm not wishing to sound in any way making excuses, because ultimately that's not why I'm here. It's a very large, complex project with, if you've got 36 isolation rooms, you've got, nearly 6,000 rooms inside the building. And so the scale of the project may have led to some oversight. Now, that oversight should be picked up as part of the QA procedures, which were managed through, from a multiplex point of view, we had a quality manager who would have extracted from the specification and the commissioning what the requirements were for each of those rooms. And so that you didn't suffer from this scenario. I can only think that it wasn't picked up as part of that process.
And there may be an argument that it should have been picked up by someone on behalf of GGC as well.
I think that there's a backstop in relation to it's Capita who have obviously highlighted this. Capita were and certainly not responsible for this oversight, but they were part of the team who would have carried out that review.
Can we go to page 296? Thank you. Now, this appears to be an email in August. So again, we're after handover some considerable time raising questions about how particular issues had cropped up. Do you remember this at all?
I didn't remember it at the time, but when I read it in the bundles, then I had some memory of it, yes.
And can you help us as to what you understand was happening here?
If you just don't, I'm just reading it, sorry, just to,
Yeah, sure,
sorry
of
to hold you
course.
back.
Seems to be something about the pressure that's being achieved isn't working properly, at least in some rooms.
So this was, I think this may be in, I've not read it all yet, but I think this may be in relation to the air leakage testing. And so Gillen was one of the original construction team. He had been on the project for a number of years and was specifically involved in the Children's Hospital. And his project manager was Fernie Shaw. I'm not sure if the email here is referring to only the Children's, because at this date, Gillen would have had more of a site-wide role to support or to manage any of the defects that would have been coming up during this period of time. So if Gillen was involved with, testing and would have, had people with, trying to find where air leakage was coming from. And so if that was the behind the panels, the IPS panels, which would be a potential obvious point for air leakage, then Gillen would be trying to identify where the gaps were and how to resolve the issue.
Sure. I don't think we'll go into the detail of that with you, Mr. Fernie. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, and it's largely because we're trying to get to the bottom of it, this inquiry, is the early filling of the water system, i.e. the filling of the water system at a date prior to handover. And I wondered whether you're able to help us with that at all. We have some information suggesting it wasn't going to happen before March 2013, so that's quite a long time before handover. Can you help us at all as to when it was filled?
I can't be specific in that, I'm afraid. Filled with water, I really can't be specific, but it's when it was filled, it would have been done under a controlled measure to ensure that the pressures didn't impact operatives, because it would still be a construction site. That the incoming water would not impact the system, so it had been tested prior to the water coming in. And then there would have been a watch put in place to ensure that if there was any leaks over the period of what would be a week or so, that you would expect any water to escape or a valve to come off or a loose fitting, then that'd be monitored day and night over the project so that we didn't have a large damaging impact of a flood. But the actual date of that, I'm afraid I don't have that in my head.
I'm interested in your answer because what you've explained there are precautions that you know of, which were designed to prevent leaks and flooding, and no doubt very sensibly. So, do you know what was done to try to keep the water, as it were, in a safe condition? Because it's potentially sitting there for some considerable time.
So generally, once we fill a system, we have a regime of flushing, but prior to that, there's testing of the water until the water gets to a certain rate. So you're cleaning the system through whatever's in the pipework will eventually, and obviously it takes quite some time in a project of that size. And so you do it in parts. And then once one part's finished, you then bring the next part online, ensuring that you don't have any contaminants going back into the initial tested and cleaned area. And then you have a system of essentially operatives who are nominated to go around, and like you see in, if you're in for a poor analogy, sorry, but if you're in a restaurant, you walk in, you see in the toilet, there's an inspection of someone's come in and signed to say that they've cleaned the toilet that day or they've inspected it every hour. Then we would have a signatory person going around and flushing the toilet, running the taps for a certain period of time, and doing that right around the campus as the project grew in size.
And why are you doing these things? Why do you understand you're doing these things?
So, again, not an infection control expert, but I know that if the water is allowed to sit in the system, then there are potential problems with contaminants growing, Legionella being one perhaps, a number of different elements whose name don't come to me now, but if you don't do it and you don't manage it religiously, I should say, then there's a potential for that to happen. And so you need to evidence that. You need to evidence how you're doing it by test results and actually the piece of paper where the operative signed it, and also doing spot checks and ensuring that the operatives are doing it instead of doing something else.
And do you know, and if you don't, just tell me, who from the GGC side would be aware of this filling of the water system?
The timing of it or the process?
Well, both.
Oh, so the timing of it, it would be discussed at the project meetings. So the project, so for me, it would have been David Loudon would have been made aware of that, Peter Moyer, David Hall. That would certainly not be something that we would do without agreeing it. We would then advise them of the process to ensure that we were managing the water.
Yeah, one of the issues that's cropped up in this inquiry is what's been described as the size and complexity of the water system at this very large build. Was that an issue for Multiplex in trying to keep it safe?
No, I don't believe so. And I believe because, again, some context in that is that we have a supersized project, for want of a better term, which is a very complex build and requires careful handling until you hand it over and after you hand it over, okay? So management process, so my job is very much process and people. Okay, I get people to manage a process and then look at how we report on that and is it sufficient? So numbers of staff, Multiplex had 100 staff on the project and maintained a high level of staff until the completion or the partial completion of the project. We also had a large volume of management for the supply chain, so Mercury, who were ultimately responsible for the MEP installation for the hospital and would have managed the process of flushing and testing, but would have been monitored by somebody like David Wilson. And those results would have came to me as project director had there been any concerns over the results. So it wasn't the size of the project, I don't believe, was the complexity for Multiplex, other than the day-to-day doing it correctly or trying to do it correctly with the best will. What I think subsequently became was the team who were going to take over that responsibility had never encountered something like this because they had worked on perhaps smaller buildings. And so the responsibility that would have passed from me as project director over to, I guess, the estates team was something that required very careful management to ensure that that team were aware of how to manage the process as it came from being a building site to being partially occupied to then becoming a hospital building. But For the inquiry's point of view, and I'm sure you know, this is one of the biggest buildings that, or one of the biggest hospitals in the country. You know, it's enormous, so it can be quite daunting for those who A, come to the building, and those B, who are responsible for looking after it.
And is one of the challenges of doing that properly, that what you're doing is testing and spot testing, but you might not, for instance, spot test in the place where there was a problem on a particular day. You can only know the results of your spot testing.
There's a potential, I'm sure, for that, yep. But we would, to negate that risk, you would test in separate areas and take your readings from separate areas.
And when the hospital's operational, it was designed with a thermal disinfectant approach, depending on water temperatures. What was happening while it was under control of multiplex?
So during the, before,
While, after it was filled, and
Yeah, okay, so
before the heating system
yeah,
kicked in.
So that, I believe at that point that was the regime of flushing, which would be the opposite I was discussing earlier, going through a cycle. I can't remember how often we had to do it, but every tap, every toilet, anywhere there was a water source for the building would have to be turned on and let run for a period of time, and they would record doing that, and that was logs that were then presented to the project teams to give them confidence that we were doing that, and I know that was a system that was managed and closely monitored by David Wilson and Darren Pike and his team. So the spot checks were getting carried out.
Now let me move forward a little bit. We can take that one off the screen, thank you.
Just before we leave water filling the water system, you've said that you can't be specific when this happened. Can you give us any indication as to how long it would have been filled before handover?
My lord, I really can't give you specifics, but it would be months and months and months prior to handover, because we would be bringing on the system piece by piece, but it would be months and months.
Thank you.
And the reason for doing that, just for, again, context, is the filling of the system allowed us to then do the commissioning, check that the building was working in compliance to the design information that we built it to.
Yeah, in another section of your witness statement, you're asked about commissioning and validation, and to some extent we've touched on commissioning a little bit on the way past, as it were. So that page 33 of your witness statement, you see that third of the way down, commissioning works were managed by David Wilson, and then there was an update and etc. And the commissioning was on an inspection basis, witnessing rates, and ultimately achieving the contractual requirements. And what you mean by that is what was on the drawings.
Yes.
So you're not there going back to SHTM or anything like that.
No.
And then you explain that it was done by Mercury, who of course were a subcontractor to,
that's right,
to Multiplex. And I suppose it's really back to the email exchange with Mr. Loudon, where I suggested that perhaps in the result parties were speaking past each other rather than to each other. When you're asked near the foot of that page that the employer's requirements require the contractor to demonstrate and certify to the board the successful completion of all commissioning, testing and compliance with all relevant standards. And you say, well, you say today, I think, what I can do is demonstrate that I've built to the construction drawings. But how would you meet the requirement to confirm that you've been building to all the standards? Simply by saying the construction drawings must be the standards.
Yeah, and I say that because I'm furnished with the knowledge that prior to those drawings reaching the construction team, there's been a process in place which should have captured the requirements for this building, and whoever was going to be using the building is either an employee or a patient.
I'll try and ask you one or two more questions about the kind of end point of the contract shortly. I wanted to ask you about a topic that cropped up, and I'm not going to ask you to read lots and lots and lots of supervisors' reports, you'll be pleased to know. But you're probably aware that there was a topic of pipes with open ends.
I'm aware of that, yes.
And the inquiry has trawled through supervisors' reports and finds that in different ways and in different extents of detail and with different adjectives applied, the question of pipes with open ends crops up regularly, if I can put it that way, over a period of years.
Yes.
Now, given your role in the project, first of all, do you accept that pipes with open ends are undesirable?
Very much so.
We happen to know that in this case, this was an issue that recurred. What were you doing to try to stop that?
So, this boils down to behaviours on site and how the operative. This is the very granular level of construction. Okay, and so operatives are given the role to install, whether it be reinforcement for the concrete or pipework above ceilings. They follow a risk assessment and a method statement to make sure that they are aware of the requirements to allow that work to be satisfactory. We had at peak 1,700 operatives coming to site to deliver the job. You know, I would think more than 50% of that proportion would be the mechanical and electrical installation at that point. And so what would often happen is materials would arrive on site as modular units. If we stick to the pipework, they would come to site capped and inspected. If the inspection was signed off as being appropriate, then materials would be allowed to be kept in the building ready for the next phase. And the modular unit is essentially a large bracketed element of materials that are pipework, sometimes ductwork, sometimes basket or cable tray. And the idea is that it's manufactured off-site to improve the quality of it so that we don't have site environments impacting the work process. It's then guided along the corridors inside the hospital on wheels, and then it's lifted up in its entirety and hung from brackets. And when it comes off, each of these modules has a gap whereby you have an infill piece to allow the cable trays or pipes to be jointed together. There is always a point where a cap needs to come off to allow this jointing piece to be made. And in some instances, that's maybe where Capita were finding this. And an operative, if they were taking it off at 4:30 PM and finishing at 5 PM, we would be very keen that they didn't take it off. So the method statement risk assessment would be something, more so the methodology at this time, because the risks have been managed. But your method of installation would be part of that process. So we'd say, when you remove a cap, then it needs to be to allow you to make a joint, or if you finish for the evening or in the afternoon if it's the weekend, then you need to cover that cap. And the caps could cover medical gases or domestic water or drainage, right, or ductwork. And so it's ideal if we limit the exposure of the services by capping them at the end of the day or when they arrive on site. But the backstop to that is, whilst we continually try to do that and continually had lessons learned for the operatives on site, we still struggled to have instances where all the caps were on all the time. And that could be because the process was the caps off, the joint was made, or the operative might just be looking at his or her watch and say, it's time to go home. And so there's human error, which comes into that. And so to capture that human error, we then have a system of cleaning that pipework and cleaning that ductwork, so that whilst we do have the not ideal situation of people not doing what we want them to do on site for the MEP installation, we capture the risk associated with that as part of the cleaning process at the end, or should be. And if the pipework is damaged beyond it, then we take it away and replace it.
Well, I wonder if I just ask my question again in a slightly different way in light of your very helpful answer. If this was this question of what we call operator behaviour was a known issue, should you not have been catering for the fact that it was a known issue by doing something else to avoid it?
On the face of it, you could say that, but I guess I'm trying to inform the inquiry here that the size and quantum of open ends would be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of bits of pipe, hundreds and hundreds of thousands on this hospital. So if you've got, say, 60 pipe fitters on the project at any given day, making 5 joints a day, then you get 5 times 60 open ends, all open, and they should have completed the pipework joint or capped the end as they walked away. Not everyone would do that, but it was in a very small quantum as far as I'm aware in relation to the many hundreds of thousands of open potential pipework. And what we did do is we had what we call foreman or supervisors talks, and the operatives would be stood down, so stopped from working, and the risks associated with what they were doing discussed, and everybody then taken back through the methodology of how to do the how to manage any open ends. And that is a very commonplace thing in the construction industry, because I think it's not just a problem for the construction industry, but people do tend to take shortcuts, and managing that requires a firm hand in some instances, but more so training, and the training was what we tried to identify as being the way forward.
I mean, just if I can run back over some of the things you've said. Now, you've described the use of modular units.
Yes.
Now, I imagined the modular, well, I think this is what you described, a modular unit being brought into a partly constructed building. So I've got that.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Does the modular unit remain as a unit to be, as it were, slotted in, or is it disassembled before it's
Okay.
Installed?
So the modular unit comes in. There are vertical units and horizontal units. The vertical units sit inside the risers. The risers are the main arteries in the building. And when they're delivered to site, they can have very large elements of pipework and ductwork on them, as long as the design has allowed the MEP team to get it to construction status information. Then everything that's in that riser comes in, and we actually have the flooring installed. So when the riser drops down with the crane, it's completely shrink wrapped. So there's no chance of any damage by weather or dirt or dust. But it's open to elements in relation to whatever the humidity level would be at that point. Okay. So we drop these large units in, and these units tend to go either between two floors. They tend to go between 2 floors or 3 floors at a time. And if the floors are 4.7 high, then it's the full length of an articulated lorry that these things get lifted off and vertically dropped into place. And the idea behind it, my lord, is that we make it safe for the operative not working inside a scaffolding. We drop it in as a completed unit, and then the operative walks through the safety barrier into a riser. And the riser could be essentially this half size of this part of the room. You could have 4 operatives working on it at a time. This is because of the size of the project. But because we've dropped them in as a modular unit and the flooring is there, we know that the operative is safe. And they can then joint between the floors or every third or second floor and piece everything together. And again, we have the same opportunity for risk of open ends, but the environment means that it's not so open to dust and dirt because it's sitting inside a riser unit, a concrete shell. When the horizontal units come in, they're generally smaller, but they can be as deep as 1.5 metres, and they can be as long as probably up to 4 metres long, and even as short as 2 metres long. And they form the veins of the building for the services, and they're made up of what we call a unistrut system. So it's a metal system, and when it comes off the lorry it sits on the ceiling, and it's lifted up on rams or jacks, if you like, so small lifting elements. And basically we have threaded rod coming down off the ceiling, which is a large piece of steel with like a large screw. And the unit goes up and the screw gets tightened, and that unit never comes back down and never changes shape from the minute that it leaves the factory to the minute it arrives on site, thus ensuring the quality of pipework is standardised across the project, and the material that we use is standardised.
Now, we're obviously particularly interested in the pipework that makes up the water system. In addition to use of modular units, would part of the water system be constructed of simply pipes that are brought onto site as recognizable pipes?
There may be some instances of that, but even when you come off the main arteries of modular units, even when we come into the rooms, we have small modular units. Again, so is that we limit the use. And there's a couple of reasons for that in construction. One is the quality is maintained in a off-site fabrication, and the other is to actually try to complete all that work would have required another 1,000 or so operatives, all trying to get to the same place, working at height. So we negate that risk by doing it all off-site. And the more modules we can make, whether they're small or large, the greater control we have. And so the pieces of pipework that you're referring to would be, I believe, not commonplace. They would form part of the modularised units, but the junctions between each of the modules would be brought onto site. In fact, they would sometimes be part of the delivery for the module in a bag or in a box, that you knew the pipework between here and here, and the joint was to go in, and that's the piece that would be carried out on site.
So my rather simple-minded and no doubt a old-fashioned picture of separate pipes being brought onto site and then stored outside for a period of time in order to be brought in or put together as individual lengths of pipe is simply wrong.
No, sir, not in all instances, but it wouldn't be left outside. So when the pipework would be brought to site, this is high value material, often it's copper, and we would have storage areas which would be controlled environments, so they wouldn't be exposed to the weather. They would be clean and they would be capped end, and they would be locked so that people couldn't take it without permission. But if you again go back to the quantum of, because of the overall size of the project, the only way to deliver a job like that is to do it, in my view, and what we ultimately managed to do is manufacture the majority of the pipe work and the electrical routes all off-site. And we also looked at how we modularised and what we call plug-and-play systems, so that, you know, sockets were on the trunking as well, so that you didn't have to do any of the small jobs. You could literally walk up and plug in your light fin once that had been wired through.
Thank you.
Let me ask you about another word, validation, in the context of a ventilation system. You familiar with that concept?
I am, yes.
Now, I don't think there's any dispute that commissioning is done by the contractor. Validation is supposed to be done under the guidance by the client, correct?
In this particular project, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so that might be different if it was a PFI type project.
Yeah.
The understanding I'm going to suggest to you is that the aim of validation is for the client to decide, having carried out this testing, whether the area's ventilation is acceptable. Would you agree with that general description?
So the validation can be a number of things, right? And this is where I think in future projects can learn from this, which is the commissioning and testing carried out by the contractor is in reference, as I've already said, to the contract drawings, and there is no change to that going forward. The validation of the room may or may not refer to what the patient cohort is or who's going to finally use the room, or may just be a verification of the contractor's results.
Well, I think what I'm trying to get to, and perhaps you can assist us on thinking of ways in which things can be done better. If the contractor were to think of validation as something that had to be done before handover, so in other words, the customer had to be satisfied with their validation before they took the ward or the room or whatever it happened to be, then the contractor would have to make some kind of provision for that in their programming and other arrangements. Would you agree?
I would, but if I can talk about the kind of the last part of the project, where we went from commissioning to completion and then migration strategy, which was after PC.
Well, I understand that there's that point, but if you pull validation back to handover, does it not have the advantage that both parties, in this cooperative, hand-in-glove environment, have an interest in validation getting done and done successfully? Because the contractor, I have to suggest to you, is keen to get on and get you to take this building from me.
Yeah.
And the client wants to know, yeah, I've had it checked and it's all fine.
Yeah.
So what would you need to do to make sure that both parties had an interest in that being done?
Yeah. So you could put it in prior to practical completion, and you would identify, so going forward in the future projects, because of what I know now in relation to the complexities of after the project was PC'd, it would be about the validation exercise speaking to the patient. And what I mean is, when the patient arrives, is the environment correct for that patient, right? As opposed to validating what has already been inspected and commissioned and tested. So the validation may only be a repeat of what we've already done to validate the system. What I guess would be beneficial, and perhaps there would be two hold points in the project going forward. One would be at the construction stage, before I start to pour concrete and put the fan call units in and all the stuff that goes inside hospitals, that there's a check on, is everybody happy that this is the correct level of lighting, ventilation, water for whoever that patient's going to be and whatever service this department provides.
Well, let's pause on that one. I think Mr. Pike may be asked a similar question, and he was talking about what he described as a loop back, that you have various parties contributing to the discussions about what they want at an early stage, and then it gets taken over by a kind of building process. And you're really referring to something similar here, where you've done your design, you think you're doing the right thing, but before you start doing anything irretrievable, you have a kind of pause point, and in comes the health authority or whatever and says, right, we're going to get somebody to have a look at this afresh.
Absolutely.
And go, yeah, you're absolutely right, or how did we get here?
Yeah, and that would be potentially something that could delay a project.
Yep.
But it would mean we perhaps reduce the risk of getting to a place where people thought they were getting A and in fact they were getting B. So that would be essential, I think, going forward. And also, the people who are going to manage that part of the building are already aware of what they currently have in their building. So if it's air changes, this is how many air changes we have, and do we have that? So the conversation around litres per minute or second versus air changes, and the complexity surrounding who understands what that means and who's signing it off, I think it's got to be, in future, the clinical person has that opportunity. Now, how you manage that process is perhaps beyond my skills, but it just sounds like it's a hold point for the project team to bring that person in and say, this is what we've signed off on in our contractor. Mr. Fernie's going to go and do that. Is everybody happy? And then, sorry.
No,
And then
I didn't mean,
right.
I thought you'd finished. No, carry on.
And then the second whole point is before that patient, I think, comes into the room.
Which might be before practical completion.
You could do it. Practical completion is a name of a date.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. So we'll pause your description of practical completion for the moment. I suppose what I was getting at, you've described you were going to tell me about two hold points.
Yeah.
You've told us about one. I was wondering whether the other hold point is somewhere around where validation is assumed to be now, which is at a point when contractor's done commissioning and then the recipient says, now I do validation at the end of the exercise.
Yeah, but the validation should, I believe, not only be checking the homework of the contractor, for wanting a better explanation, but actually checking that it fits the bill for the patient.
Because, as you probably know, one of the issues here is that validation wasn't done, so everything moved on. And what I was trying to explore with you, and I'm very grateful to you for your answers, are how we might build in some requirement for validation so that it's in the minds of both the client of the job and the contractor.
Yeah.
Because that way there's perhaps a better chance of it happening.
And also the definition of validation probably needs to be very clear, because I remember having conversations with Karen Conley, who was responsible for the theatres block, getting a validatory check on the cleanliness levels, i.e. Could you take a patient in that room after the cleaning process has happened? And we have a number of cleans prior to the practical completion of a building. And we also have a maintenance team of cleaners, because you can't hand a building over that's not at a certain level of cleanliness, whether it be in a clinical area or non-clinical area, back of house, front of house. But the theatre has another clean after the contractor, and that to me is a validation of that area, but it doesn't necessarily talk to the contractor's commissioning rates for, you know, like a theatre canopy or something like that.
Could I just clarify, you were describing what Mr. Connell described as the first hold point. Could you just define for me, I wasn't entirely clear where
it is.
Your first hold point would be in the history of design into construction.
Yeah. So the ABC status of drone information means that information goes back and forward between multiplex and the Greater Glasgow team. Once you get to approved or agreed status, and I use those words intentionally, then at that point it's considered construction status. It's ready to come to me and my team, or go into another iteration of what we call working drawings or shop drawings. So once the building envelope's been agreed, then we send the drawings to a specialist envelope contractor for the windows. They produce shop drawings, and then those drawings come back in to the team for agreement, not necessarily approval, but agreement. From an MEP perspective, and it's ventilation or water supply, then my whole point, I think, would be after A has been agreed, the shop drawings have been produced, and the rates of output for any part of the building can be clearly seen as 80 litres, 40 litres, or, in talking in the right language, how many air changes am I getting? And after that's done, and then inspected by the clinical team, and the clinical team say, I can use this building to treat my patients, and it seems a very obvious hold point to then, before I start, to pour the concrete that provides the floor, that provides the walls, which then determines the spatial part of the building.
Right. So it's conclusion of design. The client has approved it at A level.
Yeah.
And sufficient drawings have been, construction drawings have been completed, which would allow the clinician, perhaps with someone standing beside the clinician to explain the drawing, to understand what is being proposed.
Yeah, I would perhaps suggest it's done as almost a presentation, as opposed to here's the drawings, what do you think? It's almost, this is what your building's going to look like.
Right. Thank you.
Now, I deliberately interrupted you when you were going to talk about practical completion, because in your witness statement, you gave an answer that I suspect is where you're about to go with this. When you said, well, practical completion is just when you get to a point that everybody's prepared to sign a piece of paper to say it's practically complete, which I thought was an interesting take on what an outsider might think practical completion was. Am I right in understanding?
I didn't mean to belittle it so much.
No.
I hope that didn't sound like that. Practical completion is a date that we target to make sure that the construction works are complete and the job changes in an instant and a fraction from being a construction project to a live building, right? And it then has an occupancy certification allowing people to come to the building who are general public, who don't understand construction, who shouldn't need to understand construction, and can access the building without having any worries about the fire alarm system or the life safety systems of the building. So PCE, from a contractor's point of view, has got a number of elements to it. One of them is it recognises when we've finished from being a construction site to a completed product. But a building as big as a hospital does not always mean that the construction work is finished, okay? Because you've got other elements of work that are required to be completed after practical completion, which should be defined as part of the completion certification or as part of the contract prior to that PC date. And there'll be a defects list, right? And defects don't always mean something's wrong. It can mean something's not completely finished, okay?
So are these two separate things then? Work still to be done and a defects list?
So if you step in at the end of January to the hospital 2015, the week leading up to that handover, I had the job going from 700 operatives for that last month to maybe 100 people in the last day. And the last 100 people would be quite a lot of staff and cleaners and life safety system MEP management team. And there was a reason for doing that, which probably I need to go back before I go forward. And if I'm allowed to do that.
No, I'm keen to understand it, because I think just before you do, you'll understand that we've had differing views recorded about the state, or the perceived state of the building.
Very keen to clear that up today.
Some people saying it was just like a building site, it was a complete nightmare. We had hundreds of multiplex subcontractors turning up the next day wanting permits to work, to do lots of things. Others saying it was absolutely fine, there were only minor things. If there was any work being done, it was being done by the board to install equipment. And there's clearly a difference in perception. So can you help us?
I think perception is a big thing at this point, actually, and people actually understanding what PC means and what it means to them as what a building should look like, and what it means to me as the principal contractor. So for me, it's to finish all the construction works and to ensure the building is handed in a position which allows the next phase of work to go through. So all my life safety systems are operational, fire alarm systems and the like. Everything that could require automation, i.e. if smoke sensors all cleared off, the alarm panel, no bleeping, everything just as it should be. So from the end of January, if you walk into the hospital, you'll see very few construction people working. You'll have a small team of people who are maintaining a system to ensure that we're doing our checks and balances, and we're desperately trying to get finished all of the small outstanding works, the damage to a floor tile, a damaged ceiling tile, a scuff on the wall because paint and decoration, you know. And we've got what's known as a temporary occupancy certificate from building control, because we've brought that service into the process to make sure that they're comfortable, because they've never handed a building over as big as this. So they need to be comfortable to know that our work's installed to the correct standard to protect the public. So those checks and balances have all been completed. We've taken the board's representative teams, Capita, and some of the Greater Glasgow teams around the project. Often people can look at a project with a month to go and think, I don't think you're going to finish it. And as a project director, sometimes, you know, the pressures there are such that you start to think, how am I going to get this building complete? But I'd like it to be absolutely clear to the inquiry that the practical completion date was a date that was a target date. And if we had to move that date due to not being ready, the contract completion date was a month later. So there was no pressure on me as a manager to maintain a date that I could move. Where the drivers come from is you have a super tanker behind you, which is the movement, the migration strategy. And so you'll see in some of the minutes with the board I was very keen to understand what the migration strategy was and how the staff were going to come to the hospital. Who was coming first? When did they come? And what support did they need from me to ensure that there was no adverse experiences as you arrived on what was still essentially my or multiplex's building. And at PC, making sure that everybody in the Greater Glasgow team understood what that meant. As in, the minute you give me that certificate, I'm now not responsible for that building in an insurance point of view, from a security point of view, or a maintenance point of view, unless we set out prior to that what it is you need. So if you look at the size of the team that were coming to manage the building versus the size of the team that were building the building, there was a drastic difference. I had a large team of MEP specialist commissioning management teams who were balancing the building. Right? So the energy centre was working, the main hospital was working, and all the different parts surrounding the estate, except for areas where the office accommodation was still, the temporary accommodation was sat, and some landscaping. So everything, if you looked at that building, you would walk up the door and think, we're finished here. The dialogue with the Greater Glasgow team was to ensure that they were comfortable taking the building off me, and I was comfortable to give them it. Because as a director in charge of a facility like this, you need to make sure that you're not going to end up with a catastrophic, who's going to take this building off me? So I think in traditional projects in the past, there was always a very much a them and us type approach to what a PC would look like. And clients often would take a building because it would suit them not to manage it, not to maintain it, for whatever reason, purely financially driven in many respects. And at other times it would be because the building wasn't complete. But the hospital was complete to the standard and service that it needed to be to allow the Glasgow team to take it on and complete their next phase of works, which entailed hundreds of people fitting out Marks and Spencer's shop, the coffee shops, the imaging area, the MRI areas. They were throughout the project. And also you had a massive team, and I don't use the words lightly, of people coming in to protect the floors that we had literally just lifted the protection off to ensure that the inspections could be carried out, the final day's inspections. It's just one of the things that happen in construction, whereby you remove the protection, so you show everybody your finished product, and then to then furnish the building, desks, chairs, beds, 5,000 rooms worth of furniture, all coming through the door, articulated lorries on trolleys. It's a large number of people. And so, as a team, we decided that we didn't want to have a scenario where we had hundreds of people all waiting to get access to the building. We agreed that we'd have a defined list of construction work to be completed after PC, and that we would have a controlled and managed process of delivering that work, carrying that work out and completing it, and then doing the inspection. And that was done through a request for access to the building through the FM team. And we also provided a support mechanism for that FM team for quite a long period of time, myself included, on call to manage anything that was not clear to the FM team or the migration team that the training had maybe not picked up for them. So we trained the staff on how to manage the building as part of the contractor's requirements to do that. And when I say manage the building, I mean the MEP, large plant, small plant. We gave them the information that they required to do that, the training. And then the O&M manuals followed through once we agreed how the O&M manual system should be managed. So that perception of, my God, why are there so many people here on the day after PC, was that the board were a super tanker of activity right behind what we agreed would be the PC date. But they came into a building that was signed off as completed And the backstop checks that were carried out the month up to that point involved the project team personally accompanying me on site to look at the areas of concerns and then systematically going through our risk register of everything that we need to turn a building on to make it live. So the thumbs up from our perspective, are we as a business happy to hand the building? Because that's really important. And then are we completing the areas of concern? So ceiling tile missing here, you know, Mary, Heather, Peter, David Hall, they split into a number of groups. I guess Mary would have done the children's, Heather would have done the adults, Peter had an overall walk round and literally walked around that building to satisfy themselves that the works were or were not complete. And even to the point of the day of PC, when I had spoken to Peter Moyer, and it was Peter Moyer who ultimately signed the building off, not David Loud. That Peter and I walked, you know, the majority of the corridors, because you can't go into all the rooms, on that day to ensure that Peter was satisfied that the fire doors was one of his last remaining concerns. But when I walked through that building, there was no ceiling tiles missing. There was no incomplete works. There was nothing obvious to me that would make me feel unhappy to pass that building over. And there was no pressure to do it from a multiplex point of view. We had another month in contract to complete anything that might have spooked anyone at that point. So I guess it is perception. And I was there the day after PC or the week after PC, and I could see the number of people coming through the building. And in many respects, it's a moment in time for the PD and the construction team to take a breath and watch how the building's getting communicated, and also watch how the building, your precious building, I don't want to over-egg this too much, but it is a very precious product to you, is then starting to get daily usage and damage potentially, where trolleys are getting bumped over and doors getting damaged and things like that. And that's when we were ready to respond to fix doors, fix floors, replace ceiling tiles. So a great example from obviously getting ready for the inquiry today, and I'd heard about people's perceptions on what was and wasn't finished previously to this. There was a number of people coming into the project very soon after PC who were lifting ceiling tiles out and drilling holes in walls to allow their works to be completed. I think it was something to do with IT. But they were drilling holes in firewalls, whilst not our responsibility anymore at PC, the thought of someone coming in and saying multiplex have left a hole in the firewall and all of the complexities that go with that meant that we had a conversation with the board to say we'll supply fire stopping material and a fire stopper who is licensed to carry out that work and come behind that trade and fill those holes. And again, I guess the picture I'm perhaps trying to portray here is the operatives that would have come into any hospital in the past would have probably thought it was all right to come and drill a hole in the wall and feed their cable through. But we knew that the compartmentation of the building was ultimately the safety of the people in the building. So we wanted to control that. And that was very good dialogue with the Greater Glasgow team. That wasn't something that we were trying to beat people over the head with. What we were saying is, tell me the migration strategy, show me who's coming in, and we will side by side make sure that there is not a car crash of a migration strategy. And that's what PC is to the contractor. So you're always going to have construction works, but it's not construction works that would remedy the building unusable. You're always going to have client fit out. So there's a Marks and Spencer's that required a complete fit out in the ground floor. The imaging area, this is why it was a partial occupancy certificate, because there was areas inside imaging that were not complete, but there were contractors working on behalf of the Greater Glasgow and Clyde outside the contract for multiplex, but facilitated by multiplex. But inside their area, they were their own contractor.
But I think the stress point seems to be around, if you leave aside physical appearance for the moment, the idea that sort of on day one, this estates team, which has arrived almost cold into this position, is having to cope with, I think the suggestion was several hundred multiplex subcontractors needing permits to work because it was now the board's building, not multiplex's building. And that process having to be managed by the people who are now responsible for the maintenance of the building, which suggested that there was a lot of work still to be done by multiplex, not by GGC.
Yeah.
Is that inaccurate?
I feel it's inaccurate in as much as the reason for anyone going back to do any work would have been to carry out what was on the agreed list. Now, there was a requirement for us to go back into the energy centre to do some additional works to satisfy. There was an inspection carried out, and it's something to do with the hot water temperature in the boiler. Required us to go back in there, and that required quite a number of operatives to go back in, but they were in the energy centre and not inside the building. And the teams that were inside the building, some may have been facilitating the FM team to ensure that they were comfortable still maintaining that building.
Thank you. I'll leave that. I think I probably just can finish on one topic for the moment at least. Three things that relate to one another: asset tagging, ZUTEC, and CAFM, the planned preventative maintenance. Now, in your witness statement, you say, well, there was a document control called ZUTEC. State's team were happy with it. Now, the evidence this inquiry has tended to suggest that the States team were not happy with ZUTEC because it was very difficult to manoeuvre, the stuff wasn't in the right place, and there was a big dispute over that went on for ages until eventually an outside government agency came in and said, we agree it's not properly populated. Are you therefore wrong to say that they were happy with it?
I would say that my understanding from the time, and this came to me latterly after this, and understanding that they weren't happy with it. And my view was that my team had told me, or had not indicated any issues, I should say. So I knew there was ongoing dialogue about how the board wanted asset tagging and ZUTEC and things like that to work, and that there was I'm not sure if delay would be the right way to say that information making its way back to multiplex to provide a platform for the O&Ms. And perhaps now in the 2020 vision of this inquiry, the training for that might have been something that we had to focus on.
But they're related. I mean, we've heard a lot about asset tagging. It doesn't seem to have been done and doesn't seem to have been completed, in fact, for a period of years, which wasn't the original intention, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But the one of the purposes behind that is so that you can operate a planned preventative maintenance system which can link to the asset tags and provide you with information when you scan the codes and so on and so forth. And one of the issues now is that, or maybe, that there seems to be an issue as to whether that system should have been available at the point of handover to the board so that they could get on with their planned preventative maintenance, and whether it was provided at handover.
Yeah.
Now, can you help us on these?
I don't know that I can be. I wasn't as close to this as perhaps, and you know, looking at it with the rose tinted spectacles on now, that I thought I was. And so, because there was nothing coming at me to say there's a red flag here, then I wouldn't seek to understand if there was an issue. And actually understanding that there was an issue all this time later, it's disappointing to hear that. But I guess my thoughts on this would be that the business multiplex don't tend to leave project directors sitting on a job for a long time after it's been completed. They agree with, and I was agreed with David that there would be a period of time that I would be involved in the project. Ultimately, things like letters and stuff like that came through me because that was the contractual requirement. I was then taken to another project a number of months or so, a month or so after we PC'd that, but there was a team left in place to ensure that the hospital felt that they still had support. And so finding out now about the Zutec side, again, I think I would maybe have put it down to perception, but if you're telling me that an independent body was brought in and said that it wasn't suitable, which I didn't know about, then I cannot say anything other than we need to understand why that happened.
And what about the CAFM, the automated planned preventative maintenance system? Were you aware of an issue about it not being provided?
No.
Can I ask you a slightly more random question? Do you know anything about the use of a non-permitted material in flexible hoses in showers, something called EDPN?
I don't.
And I think in fairness, you just told us you were sort of moved on to another job reasonably swiftly after handover. Is that
I think
right?
about a month or so, and I had a holiday after as well. So,
Well, these are the questions I currently have. If this might be an appropriate moment just to have a short pause.
Mr. Fernie, what I want to do now is provide Mr. Connell with the opportunity to check if any of his colleagues have additional questions. That might take 10 minutes. So if I could ask you to return to the witness room, please.
yes, my lord.
Please stand.
Mr. Connell?
My Lord, I'm pleased to report there are no additional questions.
I understand there's no more additional questions, Mr. Fernie, which means that your evidence is finished and you're free to go. But before you do that, can I thank you for the work you've done in preparing your evidence and providing us with a written statement, and also with your attendance this afternoon. It's been helpful and I'm very appreciative of it, but you're now free to go.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Connell, I understand you will be resuming
I
tomorrow
am.
morning with Mr. Hall.
Indeed so.
Right. Well, we shall see each other tomorrow, and if I can wish those who are still with us a pleasant afternoon.